The oak bench beneath me felt harder than stone, pressing into my spine as if the wood itself wanted to keep me from standing. My daughter's voice carried across the courtroom, sharp and rehearsed. They belong to me. I deserve it all. Marina stood tall in her navy dress, her lawyer at her side, her chin tilted like a queen addressing her subjects. When she raised the papers, the room seemed to lean forward. Exhibit A? Her attorney called it a medical certificate declaring me unfit to manage my affairs. My stomach lurched. I recognized the doctor's name, but I had never once sat in his office. The certificate was a forgery, plain and cruel. And yet it was now part of the record. People in the gallery whispered, their pity falling on me like ash. To them, I was no longer a woman who had managed a ranch for decades, who had signed every payroll check and fixed broken gates with my own hands. To them, I was an old woman slipping away, someone who could no longer be trusted. The judge's brow furrowed as he skimmed the page. Marina pressed on, her voice steadier than I had ever heard it. My mother cannot make sound decisions. She refuses to retire, refuses to release what should rightfully pass to me. I am asking for $9.5 million and the Alvarez Ranch. The words sliced deeper than any barbed wire I had ever gripped. Not because of the money comes and goes, but because she spoke of our land. The very soil my grandfather had broken with his hands in 1952, as if it were hers to demand. I wanted to speak, to shout, to tell them all the truth, but my lawyer's hand touched my arm, firm and steady. Wait. His eyes told me what his voice could not silence would serve me better than outrage. So I clenched my jaw and said nothing. But inside, I swore the vow of a fighter. Marina might have brought her lies into this courtroom, but I would bring the truth, and when I did, it would cut far deeper than she expected. The gavel struck, and the hearing moved on. But my mind had already slipped back to the roots of what she was trying to steal. Whenever I hear Marina call the ranch property, my mind drifts back to the stories my father told me of 1952. My grandfather, Raphael, signed the homestead papers with hands still blistered from splitting fence posts. He had nothing but grit, a mule, and a patch of earth nobody else wanted. He turned it into pasture by sheer will, carving life out of stubborn ground. I grew up running across those fields, chasing calves while my father shouted reminders that work always came before play. At 12, he put me behind the wheel of an old truck with a cracked windshield and no second gear. My legs barely reached the pedals. This land carries our name, not our ego, he told me as the engine sputtered up the dirt road. Never forget who sweated here before you. The lesson sank deeper than the ruts in that road. Years later, when I buried him under a lone cottonwood, I promised I would keep the Alvarez name rooted in this soil. At 48, when Manuel, my husband and partner, died suddenly of a stroke, the promise came due. I remember standing in the barn the morning after his funeral, the smell of hay heavy in the air, and realizing the herd still needed feeding. There was no time for despair. I rolled up my sleeves and worked. Over time, I built relationships with regional buyers, shifted into organic beef, and kept payroll flowing for the dozen families who depended on me. It wasn't just about survival. It was about honor. Every nail hammered into a fence, every calf born in the cold Wyoming spring was another thread tying me back to Raphael and my father. But Marina never felt those threads. To her, the ranch was nothing but chores and dust. She hated the early mornings, the smell of manure on her shoes, the endless repairs that stole my attention. Where I saw legacy, she saw chains. And now, sitting in that courtroom, I realized she had decided to cut those chains completely. The memory of my father's words rang louder than the judge's gavel as I braced myself for what was coming next. 8 months before that day in court, I thought something had shifted between Marina and me. It was a Tuesday night. Supper on the table, when she leaned forward and asked, "Mom, how much depreciation do you claim on the tractors each year?" For a moment, I just blinked. In all her 37 years, she had never once cared to ask about machinery, taxes, or the books that kept this ranch alive. I felt a flicker of pride then. Foolish as it seems now. Maybe, I thought. She's finally taking an interest in the life that raised her. So I told her, gave her figures, explained the schedules. She nodded, eyes focused, and scribbled something down on the notepad she had carried into the kitchen. The questions kept coming, night after night. How many acres were deeded? What was the appraised value of the cattle herd? How much did we keep in the business account at the bank in Cheyenne? At first, I indulged her, glad for the attention, but soon the pride soured. Her pen never stopped moving, and her eyes no longer held curiosity. They gleamed with calculation. One evening, after she asked about the mineral rights, I set my fork down and said, "Marina, why this sudden interest?" She barely looked up from her notes. "I should know what I'll inherit someday." The words struck me harder than a winter wind. Inheritance. Not family. Not legacy. Just assets to be tallied. A prize to be claimed. My chest tightened as I watched her jot another figure. That was not a daughter's curiosity. It was entitlement dressed up as concern. I didn't argue then. I cleared the dishes and let the silence settle between us. But from that night forward, every question she asked felt like a hammer tapping against a crack in the foundation of our bond, testing where it might give way. And when I later shared my unease with old friends around a worn poker table, their faces told me I wasn't imagining things. Friday nights had been my anchor for nearly 20 years. No matter the season, no matter how long the work week, I sat at that scarred oak table with 3 people who had known me longer than most. Hector Voss, the banker who had helped me secure my first line of credit. Ramona Lee, who ran cattle on the neighboring spread, and Nate Silvers, who could sell me a baler on Monday and beat me at cards by Friday. We played 5-card draw with a modest buy-in, nothing serious. The whiskey was usually stronger than the hands we held. That evening, though, the cards blurred in my fingers. Marina's questions kept circling in my head. And finally, between hands, I let it slip. "She's been asking a lot about depreciation schedules and deeded acreage," I said, trying to sound casual. "Even wanted to know the herd's appraised value." Hector's brow knit as he shuffled. That's how my ex-son-in-law set me up before the divorce. Started with innocent questions. Ended with lawyers quoting my own words back at me. Ramona leaned back, her boots thudding against the floorboards. When family starts asking about deeds, they aren't dreaming, they're scheming. Don't ignore it. "Bianca?" Nate whistled low. "That's cold talk about your own daughter." I forced a laugh, brushing it off. She probably just wants to understand what keeps this place running. She never cared before. And maybe I should be glad she finally does. But my voice didn't even convince me. Hector slid the deck across the table, his eyes steady on mine. "Just make sure your accounts are structured right. Curiosity can turn into ammunition faster than you think." The conversation drifted back to cattle prices and irrigation woes, but the unease stayed with me, heavy as wet wool. I drove home that night with their words rattling in my head, headlights cutting through the dark prairie. And when I walked through my front door, I found Marina waiting at the kitchen table, her notepad open again, ready with another question. I came home earlier than usual that Thursday. A storm had rolled in over the plains, and the crew knocked off early before the roads turned to muck. The house was dark except for a sliver of light under the door to my office. At first, I thought Marina was just reading, but when I pushed the door open, the sight rooted me in place. She was bent over my filing cabinet. Her phone lifted, the faint click of the camera breaking the silence. Pages of contracts lay spread across the desk like she was cataloging evidence. "What are you doing?" My voice cracked sharper than I intended. She jumped, clutching her phone to her chest. "I was just organizing tax records. Thought I'd save you some time." I stared at her, the papers she had chosen still fluttering from the draft of the open window. "The tax records are in the safe, Marina. They always have been." Her jaw tightened. "I thought maybe there were copies." "Copies of what exactly?" I asked, stepping closer. She gave me that look, the one she had used since she was a teenager whenever I pressed too hard. The look that said I was unreasonable, paranoid, impossible to please. "Don't be dramatic." "Mom." I was trying to help. Help. The word soured on my tongue. She wasn't helping. She was taking photographs of my livelihood, my contracts, the agreements that kept families employed and our name respected. I gathered the papers silently and slid them back into the drawer. She slipped past me without another word, the floorboards creaking under her hurried steps. That night, lying in bed, I could hear her moving in the next room. I thought of the nights I had rocked her to sleep, the lullabies whispered into her hair, the promises I'd made that she would always be safe with me. Now, under the same roof, I felt the bitter cold of distrust settle in my chest, and when the morning came, I knew I couldn't ignore the cracks any longer. I needed help beyond these walls. The next morning, I drove into Cheyenne with a heaviness I hadn't felt since the day of Manuel's funeral. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. I had called Gregory Harlan, an old acquaintance who had handled contracts for neighbors over the years. If anyone could tell me whether I was losing my mind or my ranch, it was him. His office smelled faintly of leather and dust, lined with books that looked like they had been opened 1,000 times. Gregory leaned back in his chair as I explained everything: the questions, the notes, the photographs. I half expected him to laugh it off, to tell me I was imagining shadows. Instead, his expression grew heavier with each detail. "Bianca," he said finally, "if Marina files a petition, the court can freeze everything before you even see the paperwork. Bank accounts, equipment, even the ranch itself. One motion and you're locked out until a judge decides." The words chilled me. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. "So what can I do?" He opened a folder already thick with forms. "We create Alvarez Holdings, LLC. Your equipment, your contracts. The cash flow, all of it moves there. Then we establish a family trust for the ranch. That way, it can only pass to blood relatives under the terms you set. Marina won't be able to treat it like a check she can cash." I stared at the papers. A wall of legal language that felt like betrayal in itself. If I sign this, it means I don't trust my own daughter. Gregory shook his head. "It means you've seen the weather coming. Better to fix the roof before the rain." His words landed like a hammer. I thought of my grandfather digging fence posts before the storms rolled in. He hadn't waited for the sky to split open. He prepared. My hand shook as I signed, but once the ink dried, a strange calm spread through me. Marina thought she was gathering her weapons. She didn't know I had begun building walls she couldn't see. And before long, I would discover she wasn't alone in her scheming. I knew I couldn't watch Marina every hour, and I couldn't ask questions without tipping my hand. So, on Gregory's recommendation, I called in Diana Russo, a private investigator with a reputation for cutting through lies. She had the kind of no-nonsense voice that made me believe she'd already seen the worst people had to offer. Within days, she was digging quietly into Marina's movements. I forced myself to go about my chores mending fence lines, checking calves, pretending life was normal. But every time the phone rang, my pulse quickened. 3 weeks later, Diana asked me to meet her in a diner off the interstate. She slid into the booth with a folder in her hand and a look that told me I wouldn't like what she'd found. "Your daughter's not working alone," she began, flipping open the file. Photographs spilled across the table, Marina in a bright dress, leaning in close to a man in a tailored suit. His smile was sharp, his watch glinting even in the grainy images. "Victor Dane," Diana explained. "Developer out of Denver, known for buying up family ranches, flipping them into golf resorts and luxury retreats. Half the county in Colorado curses his name." I studied the pictures, Marina laughing across a white tablecloth, Victor's hand brushing hers as if sealing a pact. Diana's voice dropped. "She's already signed collateral with him. Used the ranch deed to secure a private loan. He's funding her case, betting she'll win ownership. If she does, he takes control of the land the minute the ink is dry." My hands trembled as I gathered the photographs. It wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration. Marina hadn't only turned against me. She had gambled away the very soul of our family. I pressed my palm flat against the table, steadying myself. The ranch wasn't hers to wager, no matter what lies she told or what papers she signed. She thought Victor Dane could deliver her victory. But I had no intention of letting either of them walk off with what generations had built. And the proof of her treachery landed in my lap only days later. The knock came just after noon, when the sun sat high over the pastures and the cattle bunched under the cottonwoods for shade. I wiped my hands on a rag, expecting a neighbor. Maybe Nate with a part for the baler. Instead, a man in a stiff jacket stood at the gate, an envelope in his hand. "Bianca Alvarez," he asked. I nodded, and he slipped the envelope into my grasp. "You've been served." He was gone before I even tore it open. The words inside blurred at first, my eyes refusing to believe them petition for ownership transfer, citing mental incompetence and inheritance rights. Marina's demands were bold, printed in black ink as though they were fact $9.5 million, the ranch, and monthly support for 10 years. I stood at the fence line, the wind tugging at the papers, and let the weight of it settle. It felt less like paper and more like a stone pressed against my chest. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with Tony, my foreman of 15 years, and slid the documents across to him, his brow furrowed as he read. "Boss, this looks bad." I sipped my coffee, steadying my voice. Sometimes you let the other side think they've already won. That's when they get careless. Tony looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I could see the loyalty in his eyes. "You've got a plan." I tapped the folder I had already begun filling. Inside were copies of the trust documents Gregory had drawn up, the transfers into Alvarez Holdings, and the photographs Diana Russo had handed me of Marina laughing beside Victor Dane. "Let her think she's holding all the cards," I said softly. "The moment she tries to play them, the truth will be waiting." Tony exhaled and pushed the papers back toward me. I folded them neatly, slid them into the drawer, and closed it with a click. And as word spread through town that Marina was about to take everything, I walked out to the porch, watching dusk settle over the fields, already preparing for the courtroom where her illusions would collapse. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and nerves. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded, while Marina's lawyer, a polished man from Denver, rose with the kind of confidence that comes from fat retainers and easy victories. "Your Honor," he thundered, "my client's mother is no longer capable of managing her affairs. We submit medical proof of her decline. testimony of erratic decisions, and clear evidence that this ranch and its assets must pass to the rightful heir. He paused, sweeping a hand toward Marina. She has supported her mother for years, sacrificed her own opportunities, and now asks for what is fair, $9.5 million, the Alvarez Ranch, and continued support. Marina sat tall, a glow on her face, as if the judgment had already been written. Behind her, Victor Dane lounged with a smug half-smile, certain of his payout. Judge Reed turned to me. "Mrs. Alvarez, do you contest these demands?" The room leaned forward, expecting a fight. I drew a steady breath and said, "No, Your Honor, I agree to everything." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Gregory, seated beside me, raised his eyebrows, though we had rehearsed this moment. Marina's lips curled upward, her eyes flicking to Victor in triumph. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "However, Your Honor, I ask that the court enter this into the record." The bailiff carried it to the bench. Judge Reed adjusted his glasses, flipping through the documents inside corporate transfer papers to Alvarez Holdings, trust deeds restricting the ranch to blood heirs, and Diana Russo's investigation photographs of Marina with Victor, records of the loan, proof she had pawned the deed before ever setting foot in this courtroom. The judge's face shifted from curiosity to stern gravity. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said slowly, "it appears much of what your daughter seeks is beyond her legal reach, and this evidence," he tapped the photographs, "suggests actions in bad faith." I folded my hands again, silent, while Marina's smirk dissolved into the pale mask of someone watching her castle crumble brick by brick. And as the gavel poised to strike, I prepared the offer that would end this war on my terms. Judge Reed's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Given the evidence, the court cannot grant the demands as presented. Mrs. Alvarez, do you have a settlement proposal?" I rose, every eye in the room fixed on me. "Yes, Your Honor. I will offer my daughter $500,000 in cash if she agrees to walk away from all other claims. Otherwise, she faces years of litigation she cannot win." For a long moment, Marina didn't move. Her face was drained of color, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Victor leaned toward her. But when the photographs were read into the record, the loan, the deed already pawned, his smugness cracked. He stood abruptly and left the courtroom without a word. Marina's lawyer whispered furiously, but she only shook her head, staring at the papers spread before her. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I accept." The gavel struck, and it was done. In the weeks that followed, the partnership she had built with Victor Dane collapsed. Without him, the debts came calling, and whatever plans she had imagined turned to dust. I didn't gloat. The hurt of betrayal doesn't vanish with a ruling, it lingers like a scar. But life moved forward. I poured my energy back into the ranch. With Gregory's help, I secured the trust permanently, ensuring no one could gamble it away again. I restored the old cabin my grandfather had built, replacing its roof and reinforcing the stone foundation. And I set aside part of the land for a community agricultural program, where local youth could learn what honest work felt like: hands in the soil, sweat on the brow, pride in the harvest. I never remarried. I didn't need to. My peace came from the earth beneath my boots, from knowing the Alvarez name remained rooted where it belonged. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the fields turn gold in the setting sun, I whispered to the wind, "The land doesn't betray, it endures."